Hey guys, tonight we slip into dusty sandals and squint against the shimmer of desert heat as we begin one of the most ancient and romanticized journeys in history, the Silk Road. You're standing at the edge of something vast. Wind tickles your face with the scent of far-off spices. Your robe clings to your damp back, and somewhere behind you, a camel sneezes. Dramatic, I know, but here's the kicker. You probably wouldn't survive this trip. Bandits, blizzards, and bad water made it a logistical nightmare, but that didn't stop thousands of merchants, monks, and misfits from attempting it. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is over there. I love seeing our little caravan grow. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You take your first step. The sand shifts beneath your feet. It's not just any old path you're walking. You're at the mouth of one of humanity's longest and weirdest experiments in connection. Imagine this. From the markets of ancient Chang'an in China, goods, ideas, diseases, and dreams drifted all the way to Rome, Egypt, and eventually into the twinkling fingers of medieval Europe. And it wasn't even called the Silk Road until the 19th century. Classic historians, always naming stuff late. Back in the day, there wasn't a single elegant road. There were routes, plural. Dozens of trails braided together like a frayed rope, crossing deserts, mountains, and empires. And you've just joined that rope. It begins with camels, and not the cute Disney-style camels either. We're talking grumpy, spitting, occasionally murderous beasts that somehow became the SUVs of the ancient world. 2 humps, unlimited cargo capacity, 0 air conditioning. These animals could walk for days, even weeks without water, making them the backbone of trade through some of the harshest environments on Earth. Traders led long caravans of them through terrain that looked less like a trail and more like a place God forgot to finish painting. Now picture this. Early travelers wouldn't just pack silk and spices. They carried tea, jade, ceramics, walnuts, rhubarb, and sometimes, you're gonna love this, medicinal fungus. Yes, some guy trudged 800 miles with a backpack full of mushroom powder, swearing it cured sadness and back pain. Fringe science meets ancient marketing, but the real star of the show was, of course, silk. Shimmering, soft, and exotic, it was basically ancient haute couture. In Rome, silk was so sought after that senators tried to ban it, claiming it made men effeminate. Silken robes were seen as suspiciously seductive, and yet everyone still wanted one. Supply and demand met moral panic. Classic. The journey started in Chang'an, modern-day Xi'an, a city that once bustled with scholars, traders, and enough bureaucrats to fill a library. This was the eastern anchor of the Silk Road, where Chinese officials logged every camel's hiccup and taxed every pot of fermented yak milk. The markets were loud, chaotic, and fragrant. Imagine cinnamon, cumin, garlic, and donkey sweat. Yes, all at once. Outside the city walls, you'd begin your journey northwest through the Gansu Corridor, a narrow strip of land boxed in by towering mountains and relentless deserts. This was your on-ramp to the Silk Road superhighway. You passed through fortresses that doubled as tax stations, inns run by retired warriors, and dusty roadside shrines where people left little prayers. Things like, "Please don't let my camel die," or "May my spices arrive unspoiled." And as you trudged deeper into the sands, the landscape would begin to play tricks on you. There were mirages, shimmering oases that turned out to be nothing more than heat playing dress-up. There were also real dangers, sudden sandstorms that could bury a whole caravan in minutes, and temperatures that swung from oven hot in the day to meat freezer cold at night. Still, people came, not just Chinese traders, but Persians, Arabs, Indians, Turks, Greeks, Jews, Nestorian Christians, and eventually Europeans. It was a social melting pot before melting pots were cool. Languages mixed, currencies clashed, and somewhere in between, people shared everything from map tips to family recipes. Oh, your flatbread uses cumin. Ours just uses disappointment. And then, of course, there were the cities that served as rest stops, if you could call cities filled with spice smoke and suspicious street meat restful. Dunhuang in western China was one such stop, a Buddhist outpost tucked near the edge of the Taklamakan Desert. It was a place where weary traders paid homage to the gods before entering the Desert of Death. Cheery name, right? The Taklamakan was a vast, treacherous expanse of sand so deadly that some ancient guidebooks simply advised, don't. The Taklamakan was a vast, treacherous expanse of sand so deadly that some ancient guidebook simply advised, don't. The wind would strip flesh from bone, and compasses were pretty much decorative. You had to rely on stars, stories, and sometimes the bones of less lucky travelers. And just when you thought you were alone in the wilderness, boom, a mirage turns out to be a real caravanserai. These were ancient truck stops, scattered every 30 to 40 miles along major Silk Road routes. They were safe havens with water, food, a place to sleep, and maybe a game of dice with a stranger who didn't speak your language but knew how to hustle. Here, people traded not just goods but gossip. What prices were good, which roads were closed, where the next plague outbreak was. Casual stuff. Historians still argue over whether these early caravans were organized government operations or more like Etsy on foot, a bunch of independent traders loosely aligned. Some think the Tang dynasty created the first state-backed trade networks. Others believe it was a grassroots effort by ambitious merchants. Probably both. That's the beauty of history. Just when you think you've nailed it down, it winks and changes outfits. And we're only beginning. So far, you've dodged a sandstorm, patted a camel on the butt, bought overpriced almonds, and questioned your life choices. And yet, this is just the front porch of the Silk Road. What lies ahead is even more colorful, more chaotic, and occasionally more ridiculous. Think secret agents disguised as monks, Persian con artists selling fake unicorn horns, and emperors who thought importing ostriches was a power move. But don't worry, you got time. We're just getting started. So there you are, sand in your shoes, camel breath in your face, and a pouch full of high-stakes merchandise strapped to your belt. And the question you've probably been asking since we left Chang'an is, why silk? Why not bronze pots or fermented cabbage or something a little less shiny? Well, silk wasn't just fabric. It was a statement. It whispered luxury, screamed wealth, and flirted with power. Soft as a secret and light as a breeze, it had an aura of mystery to it. The Chinese were absolute pros at keeping its secrets, too. For centuries, they kept the source of silk, those squishy little silkworms, under tighter security than a royal vault. Smuggling a silkworm egg out of China? That was a capital offense. They weren't joking. It was kind of like the Coca-Cola recipe or the Krabby Patty formula, just with more palace guards and fewer pineapples. The origin story of silk goes all the way back to Chinese legend. One version claims a teenage empress accidentally dropped a cocoon into her hot tea and watched it unravel into thread. Now, whether or not that happened is debatable. Scholars argue over this, like it's a courtroom drama. But what's not debated is the cultural impact. Silk became a key export of imperial China, and eventually it was the thing every trader from Samarkand to Syracuse wanted in their carry-on. Here's something weird. Silk was used for more than just fashion. It lined armor, was used as currency, and even served as early paper in China. Soldiers were sometimes paid in silk bolts instead of coins, because why not get stabbed in the chest and paid in fabric softener? Of course, silk wasn't the only superstar product. Other goods quickly hitched a ride along the Silk Road, turning it into a prehistoric Amazon Prime, just with more sand and fewer drones. Spices were next level important. Cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, saffron, you name it. Medieval kitchens didn't just want flavor, they wanted to mask the smell of meat that had, shall we say, gotten to know the passage of time a little too well. So yeah, spice wasn't just a culinary bonus. It was life-saving air freshener. And let's not forget incense. Frankincense and myrrh weren't just Christmas cameo rolls. They were massive in religious ceremonies across the ancient world. If you were a priest, monk, or mystic, a little aromatic fog was a direct line to the divine. And if you were a trader, that divine mist translated to cold, hard profit. But here's the kicker. Some of these goods weren't just traded, they were smuggled, and, oh, the drama. One of the juiciest stories involves the Byzantine Empire. They were getting sick of paying through the nose for Chinese silk. So they pulled a James Bond move and sent monks, yes, literal monks, into China, pretending to be pilgrims. But surprise, they were actually on a silk-stealing mission. They hollowed out their walking sticks, stuffed them with silkworm eggs, and smuggled them back to Constantinople. That's right, spy monks. Take that, Tom Cruise. Silk might have dazzled the West, but it wasn't a one-way street. Chinese traders weren't just giving, they were getting. Horses, for example. China had a bit of a horse envy problem. The breeds from the Central Asian steppes were stronger, faster, and generally more Instagrammable than local breeds. These heavenly horses, as the Chinese called them, were considered vital for military strength. So what did the emperors do? They traded silk for stallions. Lots of it. It said some deals were 30 bolts of silk for one horse. 30. Imagine paying for a car with high-end bed sheets, and don't forget glass. The Romans were masters of glassmaking, and their shimmering glassware made it eastward into China, where it was valued not just for function, but for its otherworldly beauty. Imagine being a Chinese noble and holding a transparent drinking cup for the first time, like holding frozen water that doesn't melt. Sorcery? Here's a fun fact you don't hear in every classroom. Ostrich eggs. Yep, ostrich egg shells made their way along the Silk Road, too. These enormous, sturdy eggs were often painted and decorated, becoming prized items for the wealthy. Think Fabergé egg, but with a little more bird and a lot more desert. Now let's talk shop. Literally, markets along the Silk Road were unlike anything most travelers had seen. You'd roll into a city like Kashgar or Merv, and boom, instant sensory overload. Colors, spices, animal noises, human chatter, children running between legs, traders hawking everything from ivory combs to cinnamon-dusted figs. If you've ever been to a flea market in 100-degree heat with 14 languages flying overhead and a monkey playing a flute, multiply that by 10. That was your Tuesday. One fringe tidbit that always makes me laugh. Some markets had professional ear cleaners. Yes. Guys who made a living by walking around with tiny scoops offering to clean the wax out of your ears in the middle of a spice bazaar. Not all heroes wear capes, some wear aprons and carry pointy sticks. Scholars still debate just how much of this East-West trade was about everyday goods versus elite luxury items. Was the Silk Road a supermarket or a red carpet? Some say it was mostly for high rollers. Emperors, nobles, popes, and sultans buying gold-threaded robes and rare gems. Others believe there was more humble trade going on than we credit. Think needle kits, salt, plain cloth, dried fruit, the usual travel essentials, like ancient Costco, if Costco had a camel parking lot. But back to the goods, the most underrated of all, paper. Yeah, it doesn't sparkle, smell spicy, or come from a worm, but it revolutionized the world. The Chinese invented it around 100 BCE, and it trickled westward slowly until it hit Baghdad and sparked a knowledge boom. Libraries, books, scientific journals, they all owe a little something to that ancient roll of tree pulp. And because we can't go too long without another weird one, rhubarb. Yes, rhubarb. This tart red plant was another Silk Road darling, valued for its alleged healing powers, especially in the West. Europeans believed rhubarb could purify the blood and cure the bubonic plague. Spoiler, it didn't. But hey, A for effort. At night after the markets closed and traders found their way to sleeping mats, the air changed. The desert grew still. Fires burned low, and across different campsites and dialects, stories floated of gods, ghosts, dreams, and distant cities. Because yes, they traded goods, but they also traded tales. You would lie back, staring at unfamiliar stars, your bones sore from the day's trek, your pouch lighter than before, but your mind humming. Around you, whispers in Persian, a lullaby in Chinese, the clink of coins, the shuffle of sandals, and somewhere, the crunch of a camel chewing something it definitely shouldn't. This was the Silk Road, Not just a passageway for products, but for people, ideas, and curiosities, an artery pulsing with the shared heartbeat of half the world. And as you doze, you'll start to wonder, what happened when empires started noticing just how much cash was changing hands out here? How did taxes, tolls, and territorial disputes shape the next phase of this dusty epic? Don't worry, sleepyhead. We'll pick up from there next. You wake to the sound of camels grumbling and pots clinking. The sun hasn't quite risen yet. It's painting the sky in streaks of dusty pink and faded gold. It's early, but the markets are already stirring. You brush the sleep from your eyes, stretch your back like a half-dead spider, and shuffle into the most magical, chaotic, confusing part of the Silk Road experience, the marketplace. Now you've seen markets before, maybe even been lost in one, but nothing prepares you for this. This isn't a grocery store with clean aisles and calming music. This is a full sensory ambush. It's loud. It smells like roasted lamb, incense, damp wool, sweat, donkey dung, and coriander, all tangled together in one thick, aromatic cloud. It's colorful. You can't walk 5 steps without your eyes landing on a heap of saffron, a pyramid of turquoise, or silk so bright it makes the sun look like it's underdressed. And it's not just what's being sold, it's who's selling it. A Persian merchant with a gold tooth is shouting over a pair of Sogdian traders in matching turbans. An Indian perfumer dabs floral oil behind your ear before you can say no. A Turkish carpet seller tries to prove his rug can double as a tent, a bed, and possibly a flying device. You'll laugh, but secretly, you're intrigued. This is where worlds collided. Cities like Merv, Bukhara, and Samarkand weren't just stops. They were hotspots of humanity. People from every major continent, Asia, Europe, Africa, met here, often without a shared language. Trade required its own kind of fluency. Hand gestures, smiles, coin clinks, and dramatic haggling. And oh, the haggling. If you didn't argue over price, the seller was offended. It was practically a cultural insult not to accuse someone of robbery and then laugh about it over tea 5 minutes later. Some merchants carried little phrase books scratched onto parchment or memorized a few useful words from 10 different languages. You'd hear silk, salt, horse, how much, and no thank you in rapid succession, sometimes all at once. Deals were made through translators, charades, or just plain persistence. And when everything failed, you traded goods. You'd offer cloves, they'd offer lapis lazuli. Somehow, everybody left with slightly less than they wanted, but slightly more than they came for. That was the Silk Road way. Let's talk inventory. The sheer diversity of products was absurd. Chinese porcelain, Roman glass, Indian spices, Egyptian linen, Arabian perfumes, Tibetan medicinal herbs. It was like a fantasy novel exploded onto a blanket. Some vendors specialized in weird niches. You could buy Mongolian felt boots stuffed with yak hair for arch support, or scrolls written on bark that claimed to predict the future. And then there were the fakes, genuine phoenix feathers, real dragon bone, and unicorn horn powder guaranteed to cure heartbreak. Spoiler alert, it was probably rhino horn, and it definitely didn't work. Markets weren't just about stuff, though. They were cultural melting pots, bursting with stories and ideas. You'd overhear gossip from the Chinese court, rumors of Roman politics, or wild tales of a sea monster off the coast of India. One trader swore he'd seen a fish that barked like a dog. Another claimed to have met a man with golden eyes who never blinked. You didn't believe half of it, but you listened anyway. And sometimes, hidden among the noise and noisemakers, you'd find quiet pockets of wonder. A calligrapher selling handwritten poems on thin paper fans. A musician playing a 3-stringed instrument that sounded like a weeping ghost. A tiny old woman with a basket of herbs who could tell your fortune from the lines on your palms. You might laugh, and then catch yourself wondering if she was right. One fringe historical detail: there were people in these markets selling ice. Yes, ice. Traders brought it down from mountain glaciers wrapped in straw and stored in underground chambers. It was rare, expensive, and mostly reserved for royalty or extremely sweaty diplomats. Imagine sipping chilled rose water in the middle of the desert and realizing that someone hiked 2 weeks through snow just so you could have a fancy drink. That's Silk Road service. Now, of course, not everything was as romantic as it sounds. Behind the colorful chaos was a layer of regulation so thick it could give your local DMV a run for its money. Every major city had gatekeepers, toll collectors, customs officials, and occasionally corrupt bureaucrats who wanted a little extra to process your paperwork. And by paperwork, we mean ink-scrawled manifests written on bamboo slats or animal skin. Some cities had specialized market inspectors, people whose job was to test the weights and measures used by vendors. Too light on the scales, you got fined. Selling spoiled dates, public shaming, selling fake turmeric, immediate camel ban. Okay, maybe not that last one, but they were surprisingly strict. Some scholars argue this early regulation helped stabilize trade across such a vast multi-empire network. Others believe it was just a clever way for local rulers to skim off the top without doing much. Then there were the taxes. Sweet merchant, let's see what you've got in your wagon today. Oh, silk? That'll be 10%. Spices? Add 5 more. Don't forget the entry fee, the street fee, the bazaar stall rental, the security contribution, and the extra nice camel tax. Because your camel, honestly, looks too healthy. All jokes aside, taxes along the Silk Road were a real burden. Some traders avoided major cities entirely just to dodge fees. They'd set up roadside stalls miles outside city gates, forming little proto-malls in the middle of nowhere. A ragged carpet, a few lanterns, a strong-smelling hookah, and boom, pop-up shop. And yet, people kept coming. They risked the heat, the fees, the stink, and the scams for a chance to touch the edge of the world. Because the Silk Road wasn't just a route, it was a dream. A line drawn across civilizations that said, we're connected now. You could taste nutmeg grown 5,000 miles away. You could hold a coin with a stranger king's face. You could hear a lullaby sung in a language you didn't know, but still understood. That's the quiet magic of these markets. In a world fractured by distance, they stitched together moments of unity. One deal, one conversation, one shared laugh at a goat who wouldn't stop chewing someone's sandal. And let's not forget the truly bizarre. Historical records from some markets describe live animal auctions that included peacocks, parrots, cheetahs, and, on one infamous occasion, an elephant with excellent manners. We don't know what that means, but we're choosing to believe the elephant greeted people with a polite bow. Scholars still argue whether these markets were state-sponsored showcases or independent capitalist playgrounds. Some point to tax records and imperial decrees that promoted trade. Others highlight the sheer anarchy of some bizarre towns, where currency fluctuated daily and counterfeiters operated openly. Again, maybe both. The truth, like everything else on the Silk Road, is layered. By the end of the day, you're exhausted. Your pouch is lighter, your robes smell like 10 different countries, and your camel appears to have developed a crush on a local goat. But your heart is full. You've laughed, argued, tasted, bartered, and maybe, just maybe, become part of something ancient and vast. As the sun sets, the market slowly winds down. Lamps are lit. Stalls close. Children chase each other through empty alleys. And in the silence that follows the day's chaos, you hear it. A distant flute, a laugh, a whisper of wind rustling through silk. You've survived a day in one of history's most magical marketplaces. Next, we see what happens when this whole glittering trade network crashes into something much less pleasant. War, weather, and a truly unnecessary amount of bureaucracy. The markets were dazzling, sure, but after you've haggled over dried apricots with a man who swears in 3 languages, you realize something deeper. The Silk Road wasn't always gold dust and good deals. Now, as your caravan packs up and heads out of the city's back gate before sunrise, you start to understand the darker side of this legendary trade route. The road was long in the way that makes your bones ache just thinking about it. You could travel for months without seeing a proper city, crossing dry, jagged mountain passes where your teeth chattered and the wind cut like glass, or baking under a sun so fierce your own shadow tried to hide. And the worst part? You weren't alone out there. First, let's talk about the bandits, because of course there were bandits. You didn't really think you could carry a wagon full of cinnamon and precious stones through unguarded wilderness without drawing attention, right? These weren't just petty thieves. They were organized, clever, and often backed by corrupt officials. Some dressed as monks, some posed as fellow travelers. And if your caravan was small or too slow, you'd wake up missing a few camels, and maybe a few friends. Caravans developed tricks to stay safe. They traveled in large numbers, hired armed guards, and even struck deals with local tribes who protected them, for a fee, of course. Kind of like ancient insurance premiums, except if you didn't pay, your camel ended up very permanently retired. There's a fringe tidbit for you. Some merchants would deliberately ride with decoy wagons. The front ones were loaded with junk. Broken pottery, stale bread, fake silk. If bandits attacked, they hit the decoys first. By the time they realized they'd robbed the world's least valuable cart, the real treasure had quietly peeled off through a mountain pass. Sometimes misdirection was more effective than steal. But even the best plan couldn't protect you from the weather. The terrain was a roulette wheel of environmental extremes. One day you're choking on sand in the Taklamakan Desert. The next you're sliding down an icy trail in the Tian Shan Mountains, wondering if hypothermia can make your eyebrows fall off. Spoiler, it can. Let's talk about that desert for a second. The Taklamakan, it's not just a desert, it's a death sentence wrapped in a sandstorm. The name itself might come from an old Uyghur phrase meaning, you go in, you don't come out. Charming, right? Even experienced travelers feared it. Winds shifted dunes overnight, swallowing entire paths. Oases dried up without warning. And mirages? Oh, they were everywhere. You'd swear you saw water until you realized you were licking heat off a rock. There's a historical account of an entire caravan disappearing in the Taklamakan. No survivors, just some camels wandering out days later looking extremely done with life. Scholars still argue whether it was weather, bandits, or poor navigation. Others say the desert just took them. If the desert didn't get you, the bureaucracy might. Ah, yes, the paperwork of the Silk Road. You thought passport control today was bad. Imagine rolling into a dusty border outpost with 20 camels and a bag full of tea bricks, only to be stopped by a Mongol customs official who demands a written inventory in 3 languages, on parchment made from sheepskin, with your trade seals wax-stamped by 3 different cities. And if any of that was missing, back you go. Different empires had different systems. Some welcomed traders, others squeezed them like grapes. The Tang Dynasty, for example, had a complex network of official trade stations where merchants had to register and pay taxes. Persia had toll roads. And the Mongols? Oh, the Mongols ran the most efficient customs system of the era, but they also didn't tolerate slackers. One wrong stamp and your caravan might be delayed, detained, or disappeared. Let's pause for a moment to appreciate the unexpected miracle of caravanserais. Basically, ancient highway hotels. Scattered every 30 to 40 miles, these fortified inns were lifesavers. Stone courtyards, sleeping quarters, water wells, storage rooms, even small mosques or temples. You could rest, feed your animals, swap news, and bandage your blisters. Some were free, most cost money, all of them were worth it. Here's a quirky one for you. Some caravanserais offered medical services. Imagine limping in after 300 miles of desert travel and being greeted by a man in a turban with a goat hair stethoscope offering leech therapy. Not ideal, but better than nothing. Probably. Not every road was brutal, though. Once you pass the nightmare zones, high passes, deep deserts, border inspections, you reach the sweet middle of the Silk Road. Cities like Samarkand, Bukhara, Nishapur, places that practically rolled out the red carpet for traders. These weren't just rest stops. They were palaces of commerce, bursting with culture, color, and yes, even poetry. Samarkand, in particular, was the crown jewel. Sitting in modern-day Uzbekistan, it was like the Vegas of the medieval world. Flashy, crowded, expensive, and very into astronomy. Observatories, libraries, madrasas. This place wasn't just about profit, it was about ideas. You could meet mathematicians from Baghdad, astrologers from India, artists from China, and maybe, just maybe, a merchant from Venice trying to sell questionable glass beads. This brings us to an open scholarly debate. How much did these different empires actually control and stabilize the Silk Road? Some say they imposed order, making long-distance trade possible. Others argue the route flourished despite them, held together more by mutual necessity than imperial design. The truth, probably both. Empires came and went, but the road endured. Still, it wasn't always peaceful. Empires fought over control of key cities, battles erupted, forts were raided. Sometimes entire sections of the route became impassable for years. That's when the real suffering began, not just for merchants, but for all the towns and cities that depended on trade. Silk Road economies were fragile ecosystems. Disrupt the flow of goods, and you starve a city. Or worse, you break its spirit. Imagine a tiny mountain town where every job is tied to the road. Innkeepers, porters, cobblers, cooks. Then one day a war blocks the nearest pass. No more travelers, no more coins. The marketplace falls silent, the wells grow moss, even the camels look depressed. That's the emotional cost of the Silk Road, a cost we often forget. Behind the maps and merchant logs were real people, living at the mercy of terrain and treaties. And they endured, not because it was easy, but because connection mattered. It always has. By nightfall, you're back on the trail. The wind has softened, your caravan hums with tired murmurs. Somewhere ahead, a torch flickers by the next outpost. You look up and see stars, bright, ancient, familiar, and maybe you smile. Because even in the worst conditions, the Silk Road wasn't just about moving things. It was about moving people, about sharing stories, surviving storms, and stitching continents together with something stronger than silk: hope. And in the next stretch of this journey, that hope will shine even brighter because the Tang Dynasty is about to throw the biggest international trade party in history. You're still sore from the last leg of the journey. Your feet are blistered. Your back feels like it's been used as a drum, and your camel smells like it lost a bet with a garlic vendor. But something in the air has changed. The path widens, the watchtowers grow taller, and suddenly up ahead, the gates of Chang'an swing open in your imagination. Only now, this is not the beginning of the journey. It's a flashback to the peak. Welcome to the Tang Dynasty's golden age. You've just time traveled to 7th century China, when the empire was not just booming, it was booming with flair. Everything about the Tang era was big. Big cities, big ideas, big hair. Chang'an, modern-day Xi'an, the Tang capital, wasn't just large. It was the largest city on the planet at the time. Home to possibly over 1 million people, it was a metropolis before the word existed. You'd find 12 lanes crisscrossing the grid-planned city, lined with lanterns, musicians, and food stalls that would make a modern night market feel like a church basement bake sale. And it was here, under the patronage of forward-thinking emperors like Taizong and Xuanzong, that the Silk Road became less of a dusty gamble and more of a high-speed trade runway, with bureaucratic speed bumps, of course. These emperors saw trade as more than just economic gain. They saw it as political strategy, diplomatic genius, and a cultural flex. Trade routes weren't just ways to get rich, they were how you showed the world that your empire was the main character. So the Tang court got to work. They set up relay stations, minted standardized coins, and encouraged trade with almost everyone. Buddhists from India, merchants from Persia, even emissaries from the distant Abbasid Caliphate. If you could offer exotic goods or clever conversation, you were welcome. This wasn't just commerce, it was diplomacy on a grand scale. You'd see ambassadors from every corner of Eurasia crowding the palace gates, some bringing tributes like gold, jewels, and rare animals. Hello, polite elephant again. Others coming to negotiate deals or plead for protection. And while the emperor was the headline act, the real engine behind the scenes was bureaucracy. Endless scrolls, ink-stained officials, and rooms full of tax documents longer than a camel's mood swings. You had to declare every item, from bolts of silk to baskets of dates. And if your camels drooled on the paperwork, well, better hope your bribe game was strong. The Tang also developed what were essentially diplomatic gift exchanges. You'd show up with your goods, the emperor would nod solemnly, and then gift you something back, often worth more than what you brought. It was less about economic profit and more about making sure everyone left feeling like China was both generous and in charge. A soft power move if there ever was one. Now, don't get it twisted. All this prosperity didn't mean there weren't hiccups. At one point, foreign merchants had become so powerful in Chang'an that riots broke out between rival merchant groups. The city responded by creating dedicated foreign quarters, districts for Persians, Arabs, Indians, and more. These weren't ghettos. They were vibrant neighborhoods bursting with food, music, clothing, and ideas from across the world. One of the more fascinating historical debates, some scholars argue the Tang court was fully aware of the global nature of their empire and encouraged cultural mixing. Others suggest it was less intentional and more of a happy accident, something that happened despite their best efforts to control everything. Either way, the result was the same. Chang'an became a living, breathing international airport terminal, minus the overpriced snacks and missing luggage. Let's take a walk through the markets again, this time inside Tang territory. You'd pass stalls selling Korean ginseng, Indian pepper, Persian silverware, and Vietnamese cinnamon. Traders shouted in a dozen languages. A Greek merchant sells dates next to a Uyghur butcher. A Buddhist monk shares a bowl of rice with a Nestorian priest. Your ears ring with music from lutes, flutes, and something that sounds suspiciously like a bagpipe. The Tang people loved music, especially foreign music, and it wasn't uncommon to hear a Sogdian love ballad playing, while dancers twirled in Iranian silks. But trade wasn't just about buying and selling, it was about curiosity. You could see it in the paintings. Art that mixed Persian motifs with Chinese brushwork. You could taste it in the food, dumplings seasoned with spices no one local could pronounce. You could hear it in the language, Chinese peppered with foreign loanwords, becoming a patchwork dialect that danced on the tongue. One weird and delightful fringe detail. The Tang elite were obsessed with exotic pets. Some kept parrots, others had peacocks, and a few particularly adventurous aristocrats tried raising lions, cheetahs, and, brace yourself, ostriches. Imagine trying to house train a 300-pound bird because your neighbor just imported one from Africa. Competitive pet parenting was alive and well. Let's also talk about fashion. If you're imagining buttoned up Confucian robes, think again. Tang Dynasty fashion was flamboyant. Robes were wide-sleeved and brightly dyed. Rich women wore outfits inspired by Central Asian nomads, sometimes even donning men's clothing in public. Gasp. Hair was worn high, eyebrows were drawn into delicate arches, or, in some cases, completely shaved off and redrawn in shapes that looked suspiciously like bird wings. Chang'an became a trend-setting machine, exporting not just silk, but style. Korean and Japanese envoys visiting the court often returned home with new hairstyles, architectural blueprints, and the conviction that Tang China was basically the cool kid of East Asia. And underneath all the style and spectacle, real power. Tang armies protected the roads, policed the borders, and established military outposts along key trade paths. Some of these outposts became full-fledged cities. Others remained small, but crucial, hubs for communication and commerce. But here's the catch. With power comes responsibility, and with influence comes backlash. Toward the end of the Tang Dynasty, internal revolts, corruption, and bad harvests began to crack the empire's golden glow. One particularly devastating rebellion, the Lushan Rebellion, plunged the empire into chaos, costing millions of lives and shattering the stability that had made the Silk Road so safe. Afterward, the road didn't die, but it dimmed. Fewer caravans, more danger, less certainty. And just like that, the bright star of the Tang began to fade, leaving behind a legacy written in ceramics, scrolls, and dusty border posts. Still, the Tang Dynasty's golden age left a mark. It proved that trade could be more than survival. It could be celebration, a celebration of art, language, flavor, and friendship. Fleeting though it might have been. As you tuck in for the night, curled under a rough wool blanket near a glowing coal fire, you can almost hear the echoes of Chang'an's drums, the music, the laughter, the clink of coins, the soft hush of silk robes sweeping over stone floors. The road ahead leads west now, toward Persia and the caravan palaces of kings. but you'll carry the memory of the Tang with you like a lantern in your chest. Because once you've seen an empire at its best, you never forget it. You wake with the scent of roasted almonds in the air and a sore spot on your side where the camel accidentally leaned on you last night. Again. The stars are still fading from the velvet sky as you sip lukewarm tea, trying not to think about how many bugs might be floating in it. But the road is calling again, and this time it's leading you westward into Persia. Now, if Chang'an was the polished jewel of the East, Persia was the golden thread holding everything together in the middle. Sitting right between China and the Mediterranean, Persia was like the nerve center of the Silk Road. And the Sassanid Empire, its ruling dynasty before Islam arrived, was a key player. But even after dynasties fell and new rulers marched in, Persia's role didn't change. Why? Because it had everything. Position, culture, infrastructure, and, perhaps most importantly, hospitality with just a hint of suspicion. Persia was the original logistics wizard of the ancient world. Think of it as the Amazon warehouse hub of the Silk Road, except with way better architecture and more poetry. The Persians knew that trade meant traffic, and traffic meant wealth. So, what did they do? They built cities like Ctesiphon, Nishapur, and Ray with sprawling bazaars, caravanserais, coin mints, and storage complexes. They even set up postal systems and road surveillance long before it was cool or creepy. But let's pause for a second to talk about caravanserais, because in Persia they weren't just functional, they were fabulous. These places weren't slapped together mud brick motels. We're talking high stone walls with arched gates big enough for 30 camels, central courtyards with fountains, yes, fountains in the desert, tiled prayer rooms, bakeries, and often some guy who swore he could fix your saddle for a small fee. Picture it. Your caravan rolls in at dusk, the bells around the camels' necks clinking in rhythm. Dust hangs in the air like a soft veil. As you pass through the gate, an attendant hands you a lantern and points toward your stall. The walls glow in the firelight, and in one corner a poet from a Samarkand recites verses while a Persian merchant complains loudly about the price of Indian pepper. Classic Tuesday. Some of these caravanserais were run by the government, others by wealthy merchants or religious foundations. Regardless of who owned them, they served a crucial purpose: keeping the Silk Road moving. Without these safe zones, merchants wouldn't risk the journey. And the more comfortable you were, the more money you'd spend, which, conveniently, made the hosts richer. Win-win. Now let's talk currency. Persia was one of the few places along the Silk Road where money didn't just change hands. It changed shape. You could pay in Chinese copper coins, Roman denarii, Indian silver drachmas, or even Byzantine gold solidi. Persian money changers had to be walking encyclopedias of currency. And trust me, they charged accordingly. Some travelers joked that you'd lose more money in exchange fees than you would to bandits. At least the bandits had the decency to run, but trade wasn't just about stuff. It was also about stories. Every night in the courtyard of a Persian inn, you'd hear tales from travelers who'd just come through the Zagros Mountains or crossed the Black Sea. There were rumors of sea monsters in the Indian Ocean, of magical cities made of glass, of Persian kings who could predict earthquakes using only tea leaves and eyebrow twitches. One fringe tidbit: there were Persian alchemists who believed you could turn copper into gold using powdered silk. Yes, silk again. That shimmering thread somehow made its way into the realm of pseudoscience. Spoiler alert, they didn't invent gold, but they did leave behind some pretty fancy copper cups. Now let's get a little philosophical. One of the most important things Persia gave to the Silk Road wasn't silk or spices, it was ideas. Zoroastrianism, the ancient Persian religion, traveled with traders and influenced later Abrahamic religions. Its focus on light versus dark, on moral dualism, and on fire as a sacred force, all of that shimmered through the region's philosophical backbone. And then came Islam. When Arab conquerors swept through Persia in the 7th century, the Sassanid Empire fell. But instead of crushing the flow of trade, the Islamic Caliphate embraced it. Baghdad, built soon after, quickly became the new beating heart of the road, and Persian merchants adapted fast. They converted, they kept trading, and they kept innovating. The Abbasid Caliphate, which ruled from Baghdad, loved knowledge almost as much as it loved taxes. Under their rule, the Silk Road didn't just survive, it evolved. New roads were paved, old ones were reinforced, trade increased, and Persian scholars became the glue that held East and West together. Scholars still debate whether this golden age of Islamic science and art was due more to Persian influence or Arab governance. Some say Persia brought the intellectual legacy of previous empires. Others credit the inclusive policies of the caliphs. Most likely it was the mix, Persian organization with Islamic ambition. And then, of course, there was the poetry. If you've never heard Persian poetry, imagine someone wrapping up love, sorrow, wine, God, and existential dread into 4 lines that rhyme better than your entire romantic history. Poets like Rumi and Hafez were born out of this cultural cocktail. Their words traveled the Silk Road too, on scrolls, in song, and whispered over shared cups of tea. By the way, that tea you're sipping, there's a solid chance the leaves were traded through Persia, sweetened with sugar from India, served in Chinese porcelain, and spiked with cardamom because some spice vendor swore it would awaken the mind. This was Persia's true genius, integration. You didn't just pass through Persia. You became part of it, whether through a recipe, a rug pattern, or a random dream inspired by stargazing in a desert courtyard. But even Persia had enemies. Empires rose on its borders, the Byzantines to the west, the Turks to the north, and eventually the Mongols. And while we're not quite to that part of the journey yet, don't worry, Genghis Khan is coming. Persia would eventually become one of the Mongol Empire's prized possessions and one of its most resilient survivors. Even today, remnants of those Persian caravanserais still dot the landscape. Crumbling walls, faded tilework, inscriptions in languages nobody speaks anymore, but they whisper. If you listen closely enough, you'll hear echoes of coins being counted, spices being measured, and laughter spilling into the night from a table full of road-weary friends. You wrap your cloak tighter as the desert breeze picks up. In the distance, a fire crackles. Your camel grunts in its sleep. The stars above Persia feel closer somehow, like someone spilled a bag of diamonds across velvet. And you realize something. This isn't just history, it's legacy. Persia didn't just connect the Silk Road's dots, it inked them into permanence. Next, we'll follow the ripple effect of those ideas, goods, and faiths into monasteries, mosques, and mountain shrines. Because coming up is the great spiritual migration that rode the Silk Road, like a whisper on the wind. By now, you're used to waking up in strange places, sometimes under a Persian sky, sometimes in a city that hums with 10 languages, sometimes beside a camel who's definitely plotting something. This morning, though, as you pack up your satchel and peer at the horizon, you sense a shift. The road is still the same, dusty, endless, and full of questionable breakfast choices, but the faces around you are changing. Merchants are still everywhere, of course, but now you notice more monks, priests, and wandering mystics drifting in and out of the crowd. Their robes are sometimes plain, sometimes so dazzling you'd swear they robbed a fireworks stand. Some carry little statues, others battered scrolls, and each of them in their own quiet way is on a mission to spread ideas as valuable and sometimes as dangerous as silk itself. Welcome to the spiritual Silk Road, where beliefs traveled farther and faster than any camel caravan, and where a stray conversation at a tea house could spark a revolution. Let's start in the East. Buddhism, born in India centuries before, had been working its way north and east along the trade routes for generations. It snuck into China like a polite guest, one who quickly makes themselves at home, rearranges your furniture, and teaches your kids to meditate. Buddhist monks established monasteries at key Silk Road cities, Dunhuang, Turpan, Khotan, and beyond. These weren't just places for chanting and contemplation. They were spiritual motels, offering weary travelers food, rest, and sometimes even medical care. Some scholars argue monks invented the original granola bar. Jury's still out. The Mogao Caves at Dunhuang, carved into a cliff along the road, became a spiritual crossroads and a giant art gallery. Hundreds of caves painted with scenes from Buddha's life and packed with statues, scrolls, and offerings. Some of the earliest printed books in the world were found here, sealed away for centuries. Imagine stumbling on a 1,000-year-old library because you got lost looking for a place to pee. Fringe fact time: Buddhist monks often traveled with small relics, bits of bone, teeth, or even ashes from the Buddha or later saints, carrying them in ornate reliquaries. Some traders saw these relics as lucky charms, while others just hoped they'd keep bandits away. Either way, the relics made the journey thousands of miles, sometimes changing hands in secret deals or being smuggled across borders hidden in hollowed-out walking sticks. If those sticks sound familiar, that's because they were the original multi-purpose Silk Road gadget, used by spies, monks, and merchants alike. But Buddhism wasn't the only faith catching a ride on the Silk Road. Zoroastrianism, with its sacred fires and worship of Ahura Mazda, traveled from Persia east and west, its temples lighting up the night from Anatolia to China. Nestorian Christianity, exiled from Rome for theological reasons, rode east with merchants and missionaries, establishing churches in Central Asia, and even China long before most Europeans had any clue where China was. Armenian merchants brought their cross-shaped bread and ancient hymns. And the Jews, always there, always trading, always finding a place to set up a shop, sometimes right next to the main mosque or monastery. And then came Islam. After the rise of the Islamic Caliphate, Muslim traders, scholars, and Sufi mystics joined the fray, spreading not just religion but language, law, and learning. The Arabic script became the lingua franca of trade and science. Mosques sprouted beside market stalls, offering oases of calm and sometimes air conditioning, if you counted a shade tree and a fountain as air conditioning. Here's a mainstream historical fact. The famous city of Samarkand was home to one of the oldest and most spectacular Islamic madrasas, religious schools that doubled as centers of science and art. The city's blue-tiled domes glimmered in the sun, reflecting the crossroads of faith and learning that defined the region. Of course, spiritual competition was fierce. There were debates, sometimes friendly, sometimes not, and caravanserai, courtyards, and over merchant dinners. Did karma beat fate? Was fire holier than water? Could you meditate your way out of taxes? Sadly, no. Still, despite occasional scuffles, the main effect of all this movement was a mind-boggling exchange of ideas. Open scholarly debate. Just how tolerant were Silk Road societies? Some historians argue the mix of faiths led to frequent tensions, temple burnings, riots, the occasional poison tea. Others believe that commerce created a kind of détente. When everyone's livelihood depended on peace, you learned to keep your sermons short and your swords sheathed. Most likely, it was a messy middle, tolerance most days, trouble on the rest. But let's get back to the sights and sounds. Imagine entering a city like Bukhara at dusk. Bells ring from a Buddhist monastery on one side of the market. A Zoroastrian priest tends a sacred fire on the other. Down the street, a Sufi dervish spins an ecstatic dance, while a Jewish family lights candles for Sabbath. You find yourself invited to share a meal with Armenian traders, spiced lamb and flatbread, washed down with pomegranate wine. The conversation drifts from God to gossip, from camel care to poetry, all in a jumble of languages. And what about the ordinary people? Not everyone along the road was a scholar or a saint. Many just wanted a blessing for safe passage, a good harvest, or healthy children. They left offerings at roadside shrines, coins, food, little bundles of herbs, or tied prayer flags to tree branches. The Silk Road was lined with these humble hopes fluttering in the wind. Here's another odd tidbit. In some towns, people believed certain springs or wells had magical powers. Merchants would detour miles out of their way just to drink the lucky water. Some even bottled it and tried to sell it at market. If you've ever bought overpriced miracle water at an airport kiosk, congratulations. You're part of a 2,000-year-old tradition. Let's not forget the darker side. While the Silk Road carried wisdom and wonder, it also trafficked in things far less noble. Some temples and monasteries were funded by protection rackets or forced donations. Religious relics were sometimes faked or stolen and sold for profit. And missionaries weren't always peaceful. Occasionally, their efforts to convert new followers sparked unrest. There's an old saying, wherever 2 or 3 are gathered in the name of commerce, someone will try to sell a ticket. Yet for every story of conflict, there are dozens more of curiosity, hospitality, and unexpected kinship. Sufi poets wrote verses about the unity of all faiths. Buddhist monks copied Muslim and Christian texts. Zoroastrian fire temples loaned storage space to traveling rabbis. Because at the end of the day, everyone needed shelter, food, and the occasional friendly face. As night settles, you find yourself sitting outside a caravanserai, under a sky dusted with stars, sharing figs with a Persian scholar and a Mongolian monks. The fire crackles, stories tumble out, and for a moment the world feels small and possible. Tomorrow the road will stretch ahead again, long, dangerous, full of surprises. But tonight you're exactly where you should be, a tiny dot on a giant map, nestled between wisdom and wonder, with faiths as diverse as the stars overhead. The Silk Road wasn't just a highway for goods. It was the original superhighway for the soul. The sun peaks over the horizon, and for the first time in days, you notice the caravan's mood has changed. There's an odd sense of security in the air, like a shared secret. No more glancing over your shoulder every 5 minutes for bandits. Even the camels seem to strut a bit, as if they know the rules have shifted. Welcome to the Mongol era, where, for a few remarkable decades, the Silk Road was the safest highway on Earth. That's right, the Mongols, history's favorite horse lords, often cast as wild-eyed destroyers, turn out to have been shockingly good at logistics. Imagine if Amazon delivery was run by a guy on horseback with a bow, who could reach Beijing by breakfast and Baghdad by dinner. Let's set the scene. It's the early 1200s, and Genghis Khan has just finished rearranging the map of Eurasia in his own, creative fashion. The Mongol Empire now stretches from the Pacific to the Black Sea, swallowing up chunks of China, Central Asia, Persia, and even brushing the edges of Europe. All that territory means an empire stuffed with merchants, monks, spies, diplomats, and dreamers, plus a few thousand very nervous tax collectors. Here's the mainstream fact. Under the Mongols, something called the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol Peace, transformed the Silk Road. They planted watchtowers along every major route, sent out patrols, and cracked down on banditry with all the subtlety of a thunderstorm. If you stole from a merchant caravan, you could expect swift, creative justice. The Mongols didn't just punish crime, they turned safety into a marketing campaign. Come trade with us, your camels are safer than your mother's teapot. Caravans grew larger, more confident. Diplomatic envoys zipped between khans with official passes, paisi, silver, or gold medallions that were the medieval world's version of a do not disturb sign for imperial highways. If you flashed your paisi, Mongol soldiers were obligated to feed your horses, offer you lodging, and help you along. Some scholars still debate whether these passes were truly universal, or if they just made you a more interesting target for bureaucratic extortion. Either way, most travelers agreed it beat trying to sneak past a bored steppe warlord. Now let's talk infrastructure. The Mongols didn't just inherit the road, they upgraded it. They expanded the YAM system, a relay network of stations where couriers could swap tired horses for fresh ones, grab a bite, and relay messages or news. Think of it as the world's first express delivery system, but with more fermented mare's milk and a much higher risk of horse-related mishaps. Fringe tidbit: some relay stations kept falcons or messenger pigeons on hand for particularly urgent notes. There are even stories of trained hawks delivering small packages. Imagine Amazon Prime, but your delivery occasionally flies in talons first. Of course, safety and speed came at a price: taxes, tolls, and the dreaded Mongol census. Every merchant caravan had to be registered and, in some regions, outfitted with official documents. The paperwork wasn't optional, unless you enjoyed being disappeared into a Mongol administrative office. never to emerge. One Persian merchant complained that the forms took longer to fill out than the journey itself. Bureaucracy, the eternal empire. Still, even with all the rules, the trade boom was spectacular. Chinese silk and porcelain, Persian carpets, Russian furs, Venetian glass, Indian spices. Everything moved faster, farther, and in greater quantity than ever before. Entire cities sprang up seemingly overnight, their population swelling with opportunity seekers. You could hear Turkish, Arabic, Persian, Mongolian, Chinese, and Italian in the same bazaar, sometimes in the same argument over a carpet. But the Mongol stamp on the Silk Road wasn't just about goods, it was about people. The empire was famously pragmatic when it came to talent. If you were smart, skilled, or useful, you got a job. Didn't matter if you were from Baghdad or Beijing. The Mongols scooped up artisans, doctors, engineers, translators, and even clowns. Yes, they had official court jesters, and moved them wherever they were needed. And talk about mixing it up. Under Mongol rule, a Persian vizier could be advising a Chinese governor, a Russian blacksmith could be making armor in Samarkand, and an Italian merchant could be dining with a Mongol princess. It was like the world's weirdest and most ambitious office transfer program. Now here's an open scholarly debate. Just how much did the Mongol era actually promote trade and cultural exchange versus simply exploiting it for imperial profit? Some argue the Mongols were benevolent rulers who loved connecting people. Others claim their motivations were entirely practical. More trade meant more taxes. In the end, does it matter? For decades, the Silk Road was open, secure, and, at least by medieval standards, relatively drama-free. Let's get a little personal. Imagine you're trudging along with your caravan and suddenly a Mongol patrol rides up. Instead of robbing you, they check your papers, offer you water, and then ask if you've seen any suspicious-looking bandits. They even warn you about a storm up ahead and suggest the best place to camp. Your camel naturally tries to eat the officer's hat. As you share a laugh and maybe a handful of dried apricots, you realize something. This isn't the wild Silk Road your grandfather warned you about. This is a new world, one stitched together by fear, ambition, and strangely enough, a taste for order. But don't let the stories fool you. Life under Mongol rule wasn't all smooth sailing. There were plagues, famines, the occasional city going up in flames if someone crossed the local governor. Sometimes the safety of the road came at the expense of freedom in the towns. And not everyone was happy about the influx of foreigners, especially those who lost power, land, or camels to a new elite with strange customs. Still, there was a feeling, one you can sense in the letters and memoirs of travelers like Ibn Battuta or William of Rubruck, of standing on the edge of something enormous. You could ride for months and never leave Mongol territory. You could carry silk from China to the Black Sea without ever drawing your sword. For the first time, the Silk Road felt like a single, sprawling, living thing, an artery of movement and mingling. One of the oddest details, the Mongol postal system, the Yam, was so efficient that Genghis Khan could send a message from Mongolia to Persia in less than 2 weeks. Some say this network inspired later European postal services. Others think it simply proved that the world was already a lot smaller than most people wanted to admit. As you roll into a busy relay station for the night, you see the glow of campfires and hear the buzz of voices. Someone is singing in Mongolian, while 2 Italian traders argue over the price of pepper. A Chinese engineer sketches a new bridge design in the dirt. The air smells of roasted lamb, smoke, and a whiff of something suspiciously like yak butter. You bed down in the straw, feeling safer than you have in weeks. Tomorrow you'll see new faces, hear new languages, maybe try a cup of Mongol-style milk tea. Be warned, it's an acquired taste. For now, though, you drift off, cocooned in a web of commerce and curiosity spun by the most unexpected empire in history. The Mongols have left their mark. But as you'll soon discover, sometimes the best stories are the ones that get a little exaggerated, especially when a Venetian family gets involved. Morning comes, and with it, the lively clatter of an Italian merchant's voice. echoing across the courtyard. Today, you find yourself in a new kind of caravan, a mix of silk-robed Mongol officials, bearded Persian traders, and sticking out like a sore thumb in a fancy velvet coat, a Venetian who's already begun rehearsing tonight's stories for an eager audience. If there was ever a patron saint of Silk Road exaggeration, it's this guy, Marco Polo. Let's be clear, Marco Polo didn't discover the Silk Road any more than your cat discovers the living room every morning. The roots were ancient by his time, but what made Marco famous, really what made him a medieval celebrity, was his gift for storytelling. He was the world's first travel blogger, centuries before Wi-Fi, and the stories he brought back to Europe shaped how millions would dream of the mysterious East. So, who was Marco Polo? He was born in Venice, that floating maze of a city, in 1254, into a family already well versed in the international hustle. By the time Marco set out for Asia in 1271 with his father and uncle, Venice was one of Europe's busiest ports, buzzing with goods and gossip from around the Mediterranean. They weren't the first Europeans to try their luck along the Silk Road, but they would be the first to write it all down in spectacular, eyebrow-raising detail. Their journey took years, through Persia, Central Asia, the Pamir Mountains, where Marco later claimed to have seen unicorns, which, let's be honest, were probably just very disappointed rhinoceroses. And finally to the shimmering court of Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis and the ruler of the mighty Yuan dynasty in China. Now here's your mainstream historical fact. Marco Polo spent about 17 years in China, rising to a post as an official in Kublai Khan's administration. He traveled widely on the Khan's business, allegedly visiting every corner of the empire. He wrote about paper money, gunpowder, coal, palaces that glowed in candlelight, and cities so vast and rich that Venetian nobles turned green with envy. Of course, not everyone believed him. Even in his own day, Marco's stories stretched credibility. His tales were dictated to a writer named Rustichello de Pisa, while they shared a prison cell in Genoa. Yes, the world's most famous travelogue was basically a collaboration between a merchant and a bored romance novelist. The resulting book, Il Milione, The Million, was packed with so many wonders and tall tales that people started calling Marco Il Milione, as if he'd invented a million stories, not just seen a million things. That brings us to the open scholarly debate. How much of Marco Polo's story is true? Some historians take his account seriously, pointing out his descriptions of currencies, trade practices, and local customs are impressively accurate for a European of his time. Others argue he cribbed from Persian sources, invented details, or simply misunderstood what he saw. Some even claim he never set foot in China at all. For what it's worth, the majority now think he did go, just maybe with a little dramatic flair. Call it medieval clickbait. But truth or fiction, Marco Polo's stories had an undeniable impact. Imagine being a European peasant in the late 1200s, reading about cities with 1 million people, black stones that could burn hotter than wood. Hello, coal. Silk so fine, it was worth its weight in gold, and paper money you could trade for anything. Europe's mind was blown. People who'd never traveled farther than the next village now dreamed of lands full of jade, spices, dragons, and emperors with armies of elephants. Here's a fringe tidbit. Polo's book made such a splash that it inspired later explorers, including Christopher Columbus, who carried a copy with him on his fateful trip west, just in case he bumped into Kublai Khan and needed a conversation starter. Spoiler, he didn't. But Marco wasn't the only traveler to bring Silk Road stories west. Before and after him, there were missionaries, envoys, and adventurers. William of Rubruck, Rabban Bar, Selma, Ibn Battuta, all scribbling down accounts full of wonders and weirdness. Each brought their own lens, their own culture, and their own agenda. The road became not just a route for goods, but a pipeline for ideas, real and imagined. Let's get back to the scene around you. Tonight, in the caravanserai, Marco is holding court. He gestures wildly as he tells tales of palaces roofed with gold, rivers crowded with trading junks, and a black stone that burns forever. He claims he met a community of Christians in the heart of China, that he hunted tigers with the Khan, that he saw snake charmers and magicians in lakes that shone like silver. The Persians smirk. The Mongols roll their eyes. The local cook pretends not to listen, but somehow finds excuses to refill Marco's wine. Even the camels seem interested, or maybe they just want to eat his boots. As you listen, you realize that on the Silk Road, stories are as valuable as silk or silver. They shape expectations, fuel ambition, and make distant lands feel just a little more reachable. And no matter how much travelers embellish, there's always a kernel of truth. The road really is a place of marvels, if you're willing to look with wide enough eyes. Here's another twist. Sometimes travelers' tales change the way people traded. European demand for spices, silk, and porcelain soared after stories like Marco's circulated. Suddenly, every merchant wanted to find Cathay. Every prince wanted Chinese art, and every alchemist wanted a recipe for gunpowder. It wasn't all glamorous, of course. The return trip from Asia was often grueling, full of bureaucratic headaches, taxes, illnesses, and, yes, pirates. Marco barely made it back to Venice with his father and uncle, and they arrived so rich and changed that even their relatives thought they were imposters. That, perhaps, is the real heart of the Silk Road's legend. Every traveler, every merchant, every monk came home a little transformed, and sometimes nobody at home quite believed what they had become. So tonight, as you drift off to the rise and fall of Marco's voice, you think of all the stories left untold, of all the polos, known and unknown, who crossed deserts, mountains, and seas, of every exaggeration, every memory, every tall tale traded alongside bolts of silk. Because on the Silk Road, sometimes the best souvenirs aren't the things you can pack, but the stories you carry. Tomorrow the tale takes a darker turn, because not everything that crossed these trade routes brought wealth and wonder. Sometimes what moved along the Silk Road was far more deadly than a pirate or a fibbing Venetian. You wake to a cough, your own or someone else's. It's hard to tell in the dim, chilly morning of the caravanserai. Last night's laughter and storytelling have faded, and there's a tension in the air, the kind you feel when everyone's pretending everything is normal. You notice a merchant covering his mouth with a scrap of cloth, and suddenly you remember. The Silk Road didn't just carry goods and gossip. It was also history's most infamous highway for something no one wanted: disease. Let's get this out of the way. The Silk Road, for all its glories, was the express lane for plagues, pandemics, and all manner of microscopic mayhem. While most people think of silks, spices, and Marco Polo's wild imagination, the real viral celebrity of the ancient trade routes was the Black Death, the bubonic plague that reshaped continents. Here's the mainstream historical fact. The Black Death erupted in the mid-14th century, devastating Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. It killed at least a third of Europe's population, tens of millions of people, and it almost certainly traveled, in part, along the arteries of the Silk Road. But the Black Death was just the headliner. Diseases moved in both directions: measles, smallpox, leprosy, influenza. Merchants and monks weren't the only passengers packed tight in wagons and ships. Rats, fleas, and viruses were stowaways, hitching rides with every bolt of fabric, every jar of grain, every caravan that crossed from China to the Mediterranean. You picture it, a bustling market in Samarkand, traders laughing and bargaining over bales of wool and boxes of pepper. Unbeknownst to them, a rat scurries under the stalls, its fleas hopping from grain sack to blanket to the sleeve of a traveling scribe. Days later, the scribe develops a fever. He continues down the road. By the time he reaches his next stop, he's a one-man pandemic, spreading not just stories, but something much more sinister. Fringe tidbit. Some Silk Road merchants believed that burning certain spices, like frankincense, myrrh, or saffron, could ward off plague. In times of fear, markets reeked of these aromas. It probably didn't stop the germs, but at least it covered the smell of panic. And, let's be honest, camel sweat. Let's talk about the infamous arrival of the Black Death in Europe. One dramatic theory is that the Mongols besieging the Black Sea port of Kaffa, modern-day Feodosia, Crimea, catapulted plague-infected corpses over the city walls, making biological warfare a thing centuries before the Geneva Conventions. Whether or not this story is strictly true, the plague did follow trade routes west, traveling by ship from the Black Sea to Italy, France, and beyond. From there, it hopped along merchant roads, spreading like wildfire. Open scholarly debate. Was the Silk Road really the main culprit, or did ships and local outbreaks matter more? Historians still argue the details. Some point to caravan records and genetic studies tracing plague DNA. Others argue that maritime routes were even deadlier. The consensus, the answer as usual, is messy. The Silk Road was one artery among many, but a crucial one, proving that with every innovation and human connection comes an equal and opposite risk. Let's step back from the horror for a moment, because the story isn't all doom and gloom. The Silk Road also carried medicine, remedies, healing herbs, surgical tools, and yes, wild rumors about how to cure whatever was killing people that week. A merchant might arrive in Bukhara selling Indian amulets, guaranteed to ward off disease. A Persian doctor could peddle manuscripts with elaborate theories about bodily humors, while a Chinese herbalist brewed potions of ginseng, licorice, and dried lizard. Sometimes the cure was worse than the illness. Other times it actually helped. Here's an odd but true detail. Mongol rulers were surprisingly invested in public health. They sponsored doctors from across the empire, sent medical texts to distant capitals, and ordered cities cleaned during outbreaks. In some cases, they even built quarantine stations along key routes, proto-hospitals where travelers were isolated and ideally treated before moving on. This wasn't entirely selfless. Healthy caravans meant more trade, which meant more taxes. But even with precautions, disease was always lurking. You hear it in the stories whispered over the evening fire. The tale of the dancing sickness in Germany, where townsfolk were struck by uncontrollable fits. The Chinese records of a great pestilence that emptied entire villages. The Persian chronicles that described waves of fever and death as angry winds. Each culture, each stop along the road, developed its own theories. Some blamed the stars, some blamed foreigners, and some blamed angry spirits hiding in the dunes. And it wasn't just people who suffered. The Silk Road also became a vector for animal diseases. Horses, camels, sheep, all could carry sickness from one region to another, occasionally wiping out herds and devastating the economies of whole towns. A sudden outbreak among camels could leave caravans stranded for months. How did communities cope? With the usual blend of panic and ingenuity. People quarantined, fled the cities, or tried to buy protection from every god available. Markets dried up, borders slammed shut. And sometimes after the plague passed, the survivors rebuilt. Slower, sadder, but often wiser. A joke from the period. 3 things travel faster than a merchant: bad news, disease, and your neighbor's mouth. If you survived an outbreak, you'd count your blessings and your coins. Plague brought inflation, labor shortages, and strangely new opportunities for some. Wages rose, social orders shifted. Those who lived long enough to see recovery often found themselves in a very different world. There's a faint upside if you squint. The Silk Road, for all its risks, also forced societies to adapt. Medical knowledge moved faster than ever. Techniques from Indian Ayurveda merge with Greek philosophy, Chinese acupuncture, and Arab pharmacology. Scholars met in Baghdad, Samarkand, and Kashgar, sharing ideas that would eventually trickle into the universities of Europe. Modern medicine owes more to those ancient, disease-ridden roads than we'd like to admit. But tonight, in the hush of the caravanserai, you sense a shared awareness. Every cough, every fever, every anxious glance across the fire is a reminder. The same roads that bring riches also bring risk. You wrap your cloak tighter and listen to the creak of wagons, the shuffle of feet, the whispered prayers for protection. Tomorrow there will be markets, deals, more stories to trade. But tonight the Silk Road feels fragile, a line of hope stretched thin against the weight of uncertainty. Because for every silken treasure and sparkling spice, there's a shadow on the road, and in the end, even the greatest highways are only as safe as the world they bind together. Morning on the Silk Road is rarely quiet, but today, as you blink away the dust and try to ignore the lingering coughs, you notice something different. The main caravan has already moved out, but the landscape around you is dotted with clusters of tents, mud brick huts, and the unmistakable shapes of yurts, round felted tents that look like giant dumplings waiting to be steamed. These are not the homes of traveling merchants or city folk, but of nomads, the real locals of the Silk Road, and perhaps its most overlooked architects. You might think of the Silk Road as a grand parade of camels, spices, and adventure-hungry explorers. But here's a mainstream historical fact. The road only existed because of the people who lived along it year-round. For thousands of years, nomadic tribes, Turks, Mongols, Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, Uyghurs, Sogdians, and many more, were the backbone, the muscle, and sometimes the brain of the Silk Road. They raised the horses, guarded the passes, ferried messages, traded their own goods, and when the mood struck, occasionally robbed a caravan or two. It was a living. Nomads didn't just adapt to the Silk Road, they shaped it. Their seasonal migrations carved out the best routes between mountains, pastures, and watering holes. They were expert weather forecasters, desert navigators, and survivalists, able to spot a storm on the horizon or find a hidden spring in a sea of dust. Without their knowledge, most merchant caravans would have been camel chow before reaching their first oasis. Let's take a walk through a nomad camp. The air smells of wood smoke and boiling milk. Women with wind-reddened cheeks spin wool or felt, while children play games involving a sheep's ankle bones, the original fidget toy. Old men tell stories of ancestors who rode with Attila or Genghis, while herds of horses and sheep graze in the distance. You're invited inside a yurt where the floor is covered in patterned rugs, and you're offered a bowl of kumis, fermented mare's milk, an acquired taste if ever there was one. You sip, try not to grimace, and listen as your host describes life on the move. The rhythm of seasons, the hunt for good pasture, the thrill and terror of sudden storms. Fringe tidbit: some nomadic tribes believed their horses were sacred. The Kazakhs, for example, held grand ceremonies to honor the birth of a particularly strong foal, and the Mongols even buried their greatest leaders with favorite horses, ensuring both man and beast were ready to ride in the afterlife. Horse theft wasn't just a crime, it was sacrilege. Despite the image of the Silk Road as a road, the truth is that the steppe was a web of tracks, more like spaghetti than a single highway. Nomads knew every shortcut, every safe watering hole, every clan whose land you could cross, with permission and maybe a bribe of cheese or fine cloth. This invisible infrastructure made it possible for caravans to keep moving, even when official routes were blocked by war, snow, or imperial taxes. Open scholarly debate. Just how much control did nomads have over the Silk Road? Some historians argue they were the real gatekeepers, with empires and cities relying on their favor, or at least neutrality, to keep goods flowing. Others claim sedentary states eventually dominated, forcing nomads to the margins. The truth, as usual, is in the messy middle. At times, nomads built their own empires, think Genghis Khan or Tamerlane, while at other times they served as guides, mercenaries, or even customs agents for whoever paid best. You get a sense of the symbiosis as you watch a trade in progress. A merchant offers bolts of Chinese silk, and the nomads examine it with practiced hands, bartering for felt rugs, dried mare's milk, or even a particularly well-bred dog. Information flows too, news of raids, fresh pasture, or distant wars. The gossip network of the steppe rivals, any Twitter feed minus the hashtags and with way more goat drama. Here's another fun detail. The cuisine along the Silk Road owed as much to nomads as to city chefs. Roasted lamb, flatbreads, yogurt, dried fruits, and hearty soups made with whatever was at hand. These were the staples that filled both bellies and hearts. The noodle, for example, may have begun as a nomad's quick meal, twisted out of dough and boiled over an open fire. Some say the Italian spaghetti you know and love is a distant cousin of the logman, noodles served in a Kyrgyz yurt. You spend the afternoon riding with a group of Kazakh herders, learning how to read the wind and spot wolf tracks. The conversation drifts. Stories of lost caravans, heroic rescues, epic blizzards, and the occasional absurd accident. One man insists he survived a dust storm by hiding in his own saddlebag, though the laughter suggests it's a running joke. You try to steer your camel with grace, but end up spinning in circles, much to everyone's amusement, including the camels. Night falls quickly in the steppe. The temperature drops, and you're grateful for the heavy felt blankets the nomads lend you. Around the fire, there's singing and a little awkward dancing. Someone brings out a 2-string dombra, and the melodies rise into the clear sky. You realize these are not just survivors, they're the keepers of a way of life as old as the road itself. Of course, not all was idyllic. Nomadic life was harsh, unpredictable, sometimes violent, always at the mercy of weather and rival clans. There were feuds, famines, and the constant threat of imperial armies rolling in to pacify the land. And yet the steppe endured. The skills passed from generation to generation. The stories, songs, and survival tricks outlasted countless empires. As you drift off under the stars, belly full of lamb stew, you realize the Silk Road wasn't just about city-states, emperors, or legendary traders. It was as much about these resilient, resourceful people, the unsung stewards of the steppe. Their tracks might not appear on any map, but without them, there never would have been a Silk Road at all. By now, the Silk Road feels almost familiar, until it doesn't. One crisp dawn, you watch the caravan pack up, only to discover your road has vanished beneath the shifting sands, replaced by a confusion of tracks and trails that zigzag in every direction. You look left, then right, and realize with a laugh that the fabled Silk Road isn't a road at all. It's a maze, a messy patchwork, more like a plate of noodles than the tidy ribbon of trade you might see in a textbook. It's time to unpack one of the Silk Road's biggest myths. It was never a single, continuous highway. Instead, it was an evolving network, sometimes bustling, sometimes barely there, of overlapping, crisscrossing, and sometimes competing routes. Merchants, nomads, soldiers, and pilgrims took whatever path seemed safest, fastest, or most profitable, constantly adapting to weather, wars, and the ever-changing whims of kings and customs officers. Let's start with geography. The Silk Road wasn't a line on a map. It was a web. Major arteries led from China to the Mediterranean, but dozens of branch lines veered north to the steppes, south into the Indian subcontinent, and everywhere in between. If the main route was blocked, say by a flood, a new war, or a particularly stubborn flock of sheep, merchants simply detoured. There was the northern route skirting the Taklamakan Desert, the southern road dipping through the Pamirs and into Afghanistan, the route splitting west to Samarkand, south to Persia, or north to the Caspian Sea. Fringe tidbit: there's evidence that some trade routes even stretched far into Siberia and deep into Africa. Archaeologists have found Chinese coins in Scandinavian Viking graves and Roman glass beads in Japanese tombs. It's as if the Silk Road was playing an ancient game of 6 degrees of separation, but instead of Kevin Bacon, everyone's chasing silk, jade, or saffron. One of the reasons for all this zigzagging? Local politics. Every stretch of road was controlled by someone, a city-state, a bandit king, a tribal confederation, or the odd hermit who'd set up a toll booth on the only bridge for 100 miles. Sometimes the taxes were reasonable. Other times they were a test of your negotiation skills and your ability to hide valuables in your socks. There were official checkpoints with stamped documents and unofficial ones with swords and stern questions. Flexibility was a trader's best weapon, second only to a good sense of humor, open scholarly debate. Was there ever a moment when one power truly controlled the entire Silk Road? Some argue the Mongol era came closest, uniting Eurasia under one rule. Others say the sheer size, diversity, and local resistance made it impossible for any empire. Tang, Abbasid, Byzantine, Mongol, to ever dictate every mile. In truth, the Silk Road was resilient precise because it was decentralized. When one artery was blocked, another emerged. Like water, trade found a way. This spaghetti road reality shaped not only commerce but culture. Cities rose and fell depending on which routes were hot. A town like Dunhuang would boom when the northern road was safe, then wither when traders shifted south. New languages and dialects bloomed at crossroads. Towns like Kashgar, Merv, and Samarkand became melting pots, while less lucky places faded into the desert. The flexible network also made for some wild logistical creativity. Imagine being a merchant with goods destined for Rome. But there is a rebellion in Persia, a flood in the Oxus Valley, and a rumor that wolves have taken over the mountain pass. No problem. You'd send your silk on the northern road with a cousin, dispatch spices south with a trusted guide, and maybe tuck a few coins into a package on a ship bound for India, just in case. Call it ancient supply chain management. Let's wander into one of those lesser-known Silk Road towns for a moment. Say, Turpan. It's an oasis city tucked into a desert basin so low it's below sea level. The air shimmers with heat, and yet, thanks to ingenious underground canals called Karez, the city is lush with grapevines and melons. Here, Persian, Chinese, and Turkic merchants gather beneath grape arbors, trading wine, horses, and stories of the latest trouble or opportunity along the road. The town isn't huge, but it's rich with the kind of energy that only comes from people passing through, always moving, always changing. Here's a detail you don't hear often. There was no such thing as a Silk Road passport, but there were sets of standard greetings, blessing rituals, and exchange tokens. Handshakes, bows, small gifts, and shared meals all smoothed the way. In some places, you might bring a loaf of bread as a peace offering, in others, a sprig of mint or a twist of dried cheese. If you got it wrong, you might end up sleeping outside the city gates, possibly with your camel, who definitely doesn't appreciate your social faux pas. You find yourself navigating these spaghetti roads with a motley crew, a Persian with an encyclopedic knowledge of bribes, a Sogdian who can charm any border guard, and a Chinese herbalist who claims to know a shortcut through the mountains. Unless the ghosts are out tonight, you're not sure whether to laugh or be worried. As you travel, you see how even fashion adapts to the route. Traders layer their clothing in odd combinations. Chinese silk under Persian wool, topped by Mongolian fur, with a Roman coin sewn into a sleeve for luck. Jewelry mixes lapis from Afghanistan, pearls from the Gulf, and beads from Venice. Even your camel has a patchwork blanket woven with patterns from 3 different cultures. At night, you camp beside a river that isn't on any map. The group shares a stew made from whatever could be bartered that day. Carrots from the north, lentils from the south, spices from the east, a chunk of goat from someone's dubious cousin. Over dinner, the conversation drifts between routes. Which passes are safe, which towns are open, which warlords are offering protection this season. Stories are told of entire caravans vanishing in the dunes, only to reappear weeks later via a route nobody had even heard of. Someone jokes that the Silk Road is actually alive, always shifting, always hungry for new stories. Here's another fun fact. Even the name Silk Road is a modern invention. The German geographer Ferdinand von Richthofen coined Seidenstrasse in the 19th century, long after the routes had faded. Before that, it was just the road, the way, or the great trade path. Different names in every language, with no fixed borders and no tourist brochures. By the light of the fire, you think about all the feet that have passed this way. Generals, slaves, musicians, poets, outlaws, and families just trying to survive. Each left a footprint, a whispered word, or a rumor that might someday become history. No one owns the Silk Road because everyone who walks it leaves something behind. As you drift off, the night air heavy with the scent of distant flowers and burning sandalwood, you realize that the Silk Road's true genius wasn't in its straight lines, but in its wild, tangled, beautifully inefficient complexity. Tomorrow the world will begin to change as ships and sails muscle in to steal the thunder of the caravans. But tonight you dream in loops, not lines, in the ever-shifting, noodle-like paths that made the world smaller, stranger, and richer than anyone could have planned. You wake with a start, jolted by the sound of shouts and the flapping of sails. Not the desert wind, but the wind off open water. The air smells different here, tinged with brine and possibility. It takes a moment to realize you've made it to the far western end of the Silk Road, where the camels finally stop, and the ships begin to crowd the harbors. Here, in bustling ports like Hormuz, Alexandria, and Venice, a new chapter in global trade is beginning, the Age of Ships. For centuries, the overland Silk Road was the undisputed highway of riches. But by the late Middle Ages, Europe was hungry for more. The markets of Florence, Genoa, and Lisbon buzzed with talk of pepper, cinnamon, and Chinese porcelain. Everyone wanted a shortcut to the source, a way to bypass the endless tolls, taxes, and sandstorms of the land routes. So enterprising princes and merchants turned their eyes to the sea. Here's your mainstream historical fact. In the 15th and 16th centuries, European explorers like Vasco da Gama and Christopher Columbus launched an age of maritime adventure that would, over time, undercut the Silk Road's dominance. Vasco da Gama's voyage around Africa to India in 1498 was a game changer. Suddenly, ships loaded with spices, silk, and other Asian goods could sail directly to Europe, avoiding costly and dangerous overland journeys. Sea trade was faster, cheaper, and if you didn't sink, often less risky than braving a dozen border crossings and the odd plague outbreak. But it wasn't just about practicalities. The rise of sea routes unleashed a tidal wave of envy and ambition across Europe. Portuguese sailors returned with cargoes of peppercorns worth their weight in gold. Spanish galleons carted back silver, cochineal, and the promise of new empires. Venice, once a Silk Road superstar, found itself squeezed by new competitors and responded by doubling down on maritime innovation, espionage, and the occasional act of piracy. Fringe tidbit: some Portuguese ships returning from India were so heavy with spices that dock workers joked you could smell a fortune before you ever saw it. The scent of cloves, nutmeg, and cinnamon hung over Lisbon's harbor, advertising their arrival better than any flag. The old Silk Road didn't disappear overnight, of course. For a long time, land and sea routes coexisted, trading rumors as much as goods. Merchants in Kashgar would hear tales of floating cities and black ships bringing unheard-of riches to the coasts. Meanwhile, European sailors returned with wild stories about palaces of porcelain and dragons painted on every banner. Sometimes a single shipment of pepper could pay for an entire fleet of ships, or buy off a king's ransom and debts. Open scholarly debate. Was the Silk Road killed by the sea, or did it just evolve? Some historians argue the maritime routes spelled the end for the ancient trade network. Others believe the Silk Road simply changed lanes, shifting toward new markets and products. Overland caravans lingered on, trading horses, furs, and ideas long after silk and spices were sailing the oceans. Even today, bits and pieces of the old network survive, woven into the highways and railways of Eurasia. Let's linger in a port city for a moment, Venice, for instance. By the late 1400s, the city was a mad jumble of canals, palaces, and warehouses stuffed with goods from across the globe. Turkish traders rubbed shoulders with Jews from Iberia, German bankers, Greek sailors, and the occasional Mongol diplomat who'd made it all the way to St. Mark's Square. Here, the great game of trade became a contest of wits, nerve, and sometimes naval artillery. Venetian merchants, ever the opportunists, tried to control both ends of the supply chain. They cut deals with Egyptian sultans for the right to buy Eastern goods in Alexandria, then sold the same wares at a markup to eager European buyers. They invented new banking methods, insurance schemes, and the notorious bill of exchange, a kind of ancient credit card that let traders buy now and pay later, usually at a steep interest rate. Meanwhile, out in the Atlantic, Portuguese and Spanish ships began mapping the coasts of Africa, searching for gold and spices. It was risky business. Storms, pirates, and diseases made every voyage a gamble. But the rewards were so great that entire nations were willing to bet the farm. Before long, English and Dutch traders joined the race, founding East India companies and dreaming of building their own empires on cloves, tea, and textiles. But with new opportunities came new hazards. Pirates prowled the seas, waiting to pounce on a slow-moving spice ship. Wars broke out between trading powers, and, inevitably, the new routes brought the same old problems: disease, greed, and sometimes disaster. One historian famously remarked that the only thing more contagious than the plague on the Silk Road was the fever for profit on the high seas. Still, the transition from camel to sail had some upsides. Trade became truly global for the first time. Chinese porcelain ended up on English dinner tables. Mexican silver coins circulated from Manila to Istanbul. Indian textiles brightened wardrobes in Amsterdam and Paris. Tastes changed, diets diversified, and cities on every continent grew fat on the profits of exchange. Fringe fact, Portugal's new spice wealth triggered a culinary revolution in Europe. Suddenly, the bland, medieval fare of boiled meats and stale bread got a makeover. Ginger, pepper, cinnamon, and even sugar, still a luxury, transformed European kitchens. Some dishes got so spicy that visiting traders from the east would politely ask for less fire, please. Back in the caravan, you hear echoes of envy. A merchant grumbles that ships can carry 100 times more than a single camel train and get to their destination in months instead of years. A veteran caravan leader shakes his head. He's not sure he trusts a road you can't see beneath your feet, or a vessel that sinks when it rains too hard. Still, he admits, change is coming. Open scholarly debate. Did the rise of maritime trade create more winners than losers? Or did it deepen old inequalities? Some scholars argue that cities cut off from the sea withered, while new coastal empires grew ever richer. Others point out that new land routes and secondary silk roads continued to thrive in Central Asia, supporting local economies and cultures. You wander down to the harbor at sunset, ships bob at anchor, sails snapping in the wind. On the docks, porters shout in a dozen languages, carting barrels of pepper, sacks of porcelain, crates of oranges, and jars of saffron. You taste salt in the air, and beneath it all, the faintest trace of cinnamon. Proof that, even in this new age, the memory of the Silk Road lingers. As the stars rise, you realize the story of trade is never really finished. Roads become rivers, camels become ships, but the hunger for connection, for something new, something distant, something strange, remains as old as humanity itself. Tonight you fall asleep to the creak of ropes, the hush of waves, and the sense that wherever the world's highways run next, you're lucky to have traveled the greatest of them all. The sea air lingers on your tongue as you leave the harbor city behind, stepping back onto land that feels both ancient and oddly quiet. The road ahead, no longer crowded with endless caravans or lined with shouting merchants, is littered with ruins and half-buried relics. Where once there was bustling commerce, now there are windswept silence and ghostly reminders of what once was. The Silk Road, for all its fame, has begun to slip beneath the sand of history, but if you know where to look, you'll find that the echoes of those glory days still whisper in the dust. You walk past toppled columns that once marked the entrance to a grand caravanserai. There's a shattered water jug, glazed with turquoise, catching the morning light. In the weeds, you spot a worn copper coin stamped with the face of a forgotten king, so smoothed by centuries that he looks more like a friendly potato than a ruler. Here and there, the earth yields up the bones of old fortresses, a broken length of the Carrez water system, and the remnants of roads paved with stones quarried from distant mountains. Sometimes, if you're lucky, you'll stumble across the faded mural of a Buddhist saint, eyes wide and serene beneath 1,000 years of dust. Mainstream historical fact. Archaeologists working along the old Silk Road have uncovered everything from Roman glass beads and Chinese tombs to ancient Buddhist scriptures in Central Asian caves. At Nia, near the southern edge of the Taklamakan, explorers found entire villages frozen in time, wooden tablets with contracts, old shoes, combs, even a game board left unfinished on a table. In Samarkand, mosaics still glimmer in the sun, and you can almost hear the long-ago laughter of Persian poets and Chinese traders. But most of what's left is less glamorous, a scattering of everyday objects that tell quiet stories, a cracked spindle whirl from a weaver's kit, a chipped bit of porcelain from Jingdezhen, turned blue by centuries beneath the sand, charred grains of wheat, proof that people baked bread here then as now. These aren't the treasures of kings and khans, but the leftovers of ordinary lives, proof that the Silk Road was never just a parade of emperors and adventurers, but a living, breathing highway for everyone. Fringe tidbit: in the ruins of one remote caravan town, archaeologists found a stash of ancient letters, hidden in a wall, never delivered. Written in Sogdian script, they tell of missed loved ones, lost fortunes, stolen donkeys, and mothers warning their sons to eat more lentils. Apparently, some things never change. These scraps of paper, forgotten for over 1,000 years, are the Silk Road's version of unsent text messages, fragments of longing and hope. Some ruins have been lovingly restored, but most are slowly succumbing to wind and weather. Shifting sands fill the old wells, poplar roots crack ancient bricks. Locals repurpose fallen stones to build new homes. Every now and then, a farmer finds a jeweled hairpin while plowing, or a shepherd stumbles over a carved ivory comb tangled in the grass. The relics re-enter the cycle of life, trading hands at village markets or ending up in the pockets of curious children. If you're lucky, you might spot a coin from far-off Byzantium being used as a button on someone's coat. Open scholarly debate. What's the best way to preserve the Silk Road's legacy? Some argue for restoration and tourism, turning old caravan cities into museums, protecting frescoes and ruins, and inviting visitors to walk in the footsteps of history. Others worry this erases the real Silk Road, turning it into a sanitized theme park and losing the thread of living tradition. Still others believe the best legacy is to let the road return to the earth with only scattered stones and stories left to mark its passing. Even as the old trails fade, their influence lingers. You taste it in the apricots and noodles sold in a village bazaar, in the melodies played on a battered lute, in the patterns on a hand-woven carpet. You hear it in languages, Persian words in Uyghur markets, Chinese proverbs on Kazakh lips. You see it in faces, too. A freckled child whose ancestors came from far to the west. A merchant with eyes the color of Central Asian turquoise. A grandmother whose recipes blend a dozen cuisines. Fringe fact, in some Central Asian towns, wedding processions still follow ancient customs. A bride rides a white horse through the market, tossing coins and candies to children, just as traders once scattered coins to ensure luck on the road ahead. These living rituals are the last echoes of a time when the Silk Road was less history and more daily life. You sit for a while on a broken step, watching the world turn slowly gold in the late afternoon. A shepherd passes, whistling and waves. Somewhere nearby, a donkey brays and a flock of swallows rises in the dusk. The sun sets behind the ruins, painting the sky in streaks of crimson and silver. You realize that, like the Silk Road itself, every life is a trail of moments. Some remembered, most forgotten, a few left behind as clues for someone else to find. The stones beneath your feet have seen the feet of emperors and orphans, warriors and poets, traders and thieves. The road has changed, but its heart, a hunger for connection, adventure, and a little bit of luck, remains. Tomorrow you'll travel the last stretch, stepping from the ruins into the present, where the Silk Road's legacy still shapes the world in ways seen and unseen. But tonight you rest in the shelter of a forgotten empire, listening to the wind whisper through the stones and feeling, for a moment, the pulse of the past. It's your final morning on the Silk Road, The air feels different, as if history itself is holding its breath. You stand at the edge of the last ruin, shoes dusted with centuries, and gaze west toward distant highways and glass towers, east toward sunlit mountains and distant echoes. If you close your eyes, you can still hear the clink of coins, the laughter of traders, the rumble of camel caravans, and the rustle of silk beneath countless hands, but the world around you has changed. The road is no longer crowded, yet its spirit lingers, woven into the rhythm of modern life. As you step out from the old stones and into the present, you realize the Silk Road has never truly vanished. It's become invisible, hiding in plain sight, in habits, words, flavors, and even the technology that shapes your day. The lines on the map may have faded, but the connections are stronger than ever. Mainstream historical fact. Today, scholars agree the Silk Road helped shape the very foundations of the modern world. It wasn't just goods that moved along those ancient paths, but art, music, science, mathematics, and even the building blocks of modern government and trade. Paper, gunpowder, printing, and the compass. All four world-changing inventions traveled these same routes, setting off revolutions in every society they touched. The Silk Road also redefined what it meant to be local. Along its twisting trails, no city was an island. Every place was a crossroads, every market a tapestry. When you sip tea in London or eat pasta in Rome, you're tasting the old Silk Road. When you tap a message into your phone using the digits 1 to 9, first invented in India, spread by Arab scholars and adopted by Europeans, you're counting with Silk Road math. When you listen to music blending Mongolian throat singing with Persian poetry, or read a story about a journey across the mountains, you're hearing ancient voices in a modern song. Fringe tidbit: even today, archaeologists and linguists discover surprising reminders of the Silk Road's reach. DNA studies reveal links between Central Asian steppe nomads and populations as far away as Hungary and Korea. Patterns in traditional textiles from the Andes share motifs with carpets woven on the plains of Anatolia. And a handful of family-run bakeries in Xi'an still bake bread using sourdough starters that may be 1,000 years old, passed down by ancestors who welcome strangers on the road. But the Silk Road's legacy isn't only found in what you see or touch. It lives in the way people meet and mingle, how new ideas are welcomed or feared, how food is shared, how strangers become friends. The world's greatest stories are still the ones that travel, a recipe crossing continents, a lullaby echoing through generations, a word borrowed and reimagined until nobody remembers where it started. You're living proof of this inheritance. Every time you strike up a conversation with someone whose story is different from your own, open scholarly debate. What does the Silk Road mean in the 21st century? Some argue it's been reborn as new railways and digital highways. China's Belt and Road Initiative, for instance, has revived the dream of linking east and west, this time with fiber optic cables and container ships. Others wonder if the real Silk Road now runs through the connections we carry in our pockets, the global internet, the shared music playlists, the recipes swapped on social media. Is it still a road if there are no more ruts in the dirt? You walk through a modern city, maybe Istanbul, Xi'an, Tehran, or Samarkand, and see traces of the old trade. There's a Persian rug shop next to a sushi bar, a French cafe selling baklava, a street performer playing a Mongolian morinkhor. You pass teenagers on their phones, their laughter mingling with 1,000 languages, their style a patchwork of influences, ancient and new. Above you, neon lights and digital billboards shimmer beside centuries-old minarets and bell towers. It hits you. The Silk Road was never just about merchants or goods. It was about possibility, about saying yes to risk, yes to adventure, yes to the unknown. Every journey was a leap of faith, a bet that on the other side of the desert, the mountain, the next sunrise, there would be a welcome, a meal, and a new friend to share the road. That spirit is still alive, woven into the fabric of the world you wake up in every morning. A last fringe fact. There are modern explorers, Truck drivers, rail engineers, cyclists, and backpackers still chasing the Silk Road, retracing its roots with the GPS and Instagram, swapping old travel tales for likes and emojis. Some sleep under the stars, just as you did. Some find hospitality in a stranger's kitchen. They all follow the same pull, the call of a road that never really ends. So, as you stand on the threshold of the present, with all its noise, speed, and complexity, remember you're part of the story too. The Silk Road didn't end in the dust, it just changed its shape. Every journey you make, every connection you spark is a thread in the world's oldest, strangest, and most beautiful tapestry. Tonight, let the hum of distant roads and the glow of unseen lanterns remind you. The world is vast, but the distance between hearts has always been smaller than you think. Now, as the journey slows and your eyes grow heavy, imagine the old road fading gently beneath the moonlight. The camel bells are softer now, the markets quieter, the ancient cities sleeping under blankets of time. Let yourself feel the warmth of the last campfire, the hush of a caravan resting after 1,000 miles, the gentle brush of a silk scarf across your fingers. Breathe deep and picture the starlit steppe stretching out forever. A sky so wide it holds all your dreams, a silence so deep you can hear your own heartbeat. The troubles and triumphs of history are distant now, tucked away with the coins and relics left behind by forgotten travelers. There's no rush, no danger, nothing left to prove. Just you resting at the crossroads of past and present, safe beneath the watchful gaze of timeless stars. In this quiet moment, let your thoughts wander back through the winding paths you've traveled tonight. The laughter in the bazaars, the wisdom of wandering monks, the courage of merchants braving storms and bandits, all of it. Now a gentle memory that cradles you as you drift toward sleep. The Silk Road's greatest gift was never gold or glory, but the promise that every journey, however long or strange, leads to belonging. So close your eyes, knowing you've walked the oldest road in the world, step by step, story by story, until every worry has faded into the night. The world is wide, but you are home now.